Hey guys, welcome back to R&Dgarage. As always, thank you so much for subscribing to my channel and liking my videos. Well, today we are doing part 2 of my 2008 FJ Cruiser suspension teardown and rebuild. We're going to start with the wheel bearing right now. We're going to separate it from the knuckle. We're not going to use either the knuckle or the wheel parts again, but we want the backing plate. So here we go. So there's 4 bolts that we have to get loose off of this. And you'll see there's a notch, like right here, so that's a good sign that there's a bolt behind it. So what I'm going to do first is get the open-ended wrench with the box on the other side, and we're going to go ahead and use the box side. There we go. And these are kind of tough to get off, so go ahead and use your hammer to loosen them. And put some like we can watch the bolt or else you're getting around it. Okay, and then go ahead and use the open end, because if you use the box end to get it so loose when you take off, it gets out of there. And it's just pretty sticky, so. And don't tell me to fast forward because it's taking a while. These guys are annoying. So a quick note about these bolts. These aren't going to fully come out. You just want to get them as loose as possible, because once they are, we're going to turn this over and hit the hub from behind. And these are actually, yeah, I'd say these are loose enough. So get a soft-headed hammer. You don't want to use a metal hammer because it'll just shatter everything, especially, and you got to be careful of the backing plate. You don't want to wreck that with the hammer. It's just kind of a delicate job. Okay. So basically we're going to take this and bang. I don't think it's even moving yet. Starting to. Let's see. Oh, and one more thing about the steel head. It's not so much if you use it, you're going to destroy your hammer. It's if you're going to reuse the hub, you're going to destroy that. So that's a good reason why to use the soft one. Oh, I think we almost got it. Totally got it. Okay, I'm going to set these aside and we'll be right back. Now we're ready to take off the inner and outer tie rod. There are 2 clips in which to start. The one up here, unfortunately, as you can see, is walled off by the compartment, by the wall of the car here, so I'm not able to show that on camera, but I will show you after it's disconnected. We're going to move on to the second clip down here, and then after that clip is loose, which will move down here, we can push the booty down as well. So let's get started. So this is just a squeeze with a pair of pliers, the 2 tabs, and slide it down. Now this should be able, oh yeah, to move, which is great. It's still a little bit sticky, but if you're having issues, go ahead and stick one of these picks and inside like this, and you can kind of move it around. Like that. Okay, but this is coming off. Oh, just like that. Now I'm going to have my handy assistant crank the wheel all the way to the right. Now we have two locking tabs to move back, one on this side and one directly on the other side. We're going to go ahead and use a pry bar and a hammer to do this. Once these are folded back, we can remove this joint right here. Whatever you do, try not to slip off and scrape the shaft behind it. Okay, looks like both are folded back. Now that we've got both locking tabs pushed back into place, we're going to go ahead and unscrew the collar and remove the inner tie rod. Boom! Now we've got the inner tie rod loose, or disconnected. Time to move on. So now that we've got the inner and outer tie rod completely disassembled, let's go back a moment and talk about this clip right here. So this tab is actually supposed to be hooked under this tab. And so what you're going to do is take your screwdriver, get it in the middle so that you've got it positioned on this side, bend and twist back so that it pops loose. So since we're going to be reusing the booty, we're going to go ahead and disassemble our inner and outer tie rod. So first what you're going to do is break the nut loose down here, as we already did. And now that that's loose, you're going to rotate this apart to break it free. Now count the number of rotations until it is free, because you want the same length on your new inner and outer tie rod as you do as this. It'll help with alignment down the road. So 1, 12, 13, 14, woo, so 14. Now we're going to go ahead and take this nut off. And watch it go into the car. Okay. And now we can take off the boot just like that. Okay, now before we put on the new parts, we're going to go ahead and clean up a little bit. What we want to do is first clean off the steering rack from top to bottom, and then we're also going to head over to the diff and clean that as well. Okay, let's get going with those new parts. So as always, when installing new parts, you always want to check and compare the new part to the old part just to make sure that they look similar. And yeah, that looks good. Set the old part aside. Now, I've gone ahead and jacked this up, the sway bar out of the way so you can see where I'm working. But before we get to that, I want to show you this washer. See the two tabs right here on each side? That is actually going to go on on the tie rod here, but you're going to want to fit those tabs into each matching side right here into the indents. Okay, let's go ahead and get this sucker on. It's needled on a washer. Okay, moving on. So another quick note about the washer with the tabs. A good idea, since it is floating loose, is to kind of go ahead and press it against so you already have the tabs in place before you turn the rest of the rod. And that way we know for sure the tabs are locked down. So now that I've torqued my collar back to factory spec, it's time to get these tabs back into place. So what I'm going to do is use a little hammer. I'm not going to rail on it, just a few light blows, because it's never a good idea to totally rail on your steering rack. So let's get going. Side. Okay, and we're good. Here's a quick close-up of what the tabs should look like once bent back into place. So before we put our old boot back on, we're going to go ahead and use this grease that the manufacturer includes. So you can see there's already some white grease in the inner tie rod right here, but we're just going to go ahead and add a little bit more. And what I'm going to do is snip right about here, so it can be used almost like a toothpaste tube to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this in. We're going to go ahead and squeeze some around there, and you're going to want to use about half the packet. Okay, put this aside, and now we can go ahead and just kind of lightly dookie the outside. Okay, so we're ready to put our boot back on. So you guys remember that metal clamp that was around this section that we had trouble showing you guys? Well, it's not reusable. So for this, we're just going to go ahead and use a heavy-duty zip tie, which is perfectly fine. And you'll know it fits in this flat part right here. So go ahead and center your steering wheel so that it's all nice and straight. And we'll go ahead and put the boot on. So we're going to slide it on the end. There we go. And put the zip tie back here. Whoops. Oh, and it can be kind of awkward. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do is fit it into place like so. And this part here, it has to go basically above that line, if you can see it, and it'll make a sound like that. Okay, so once it's up, we're going to ignore the other side for now, and we're going to go ahead and put on our bracket, which is reusable. So whoops. Oh, how cool is that? Okay. Just the little things. Okay. There we go. So that side's good. Now we're going to go ahead and make sure that the zip tie is on this side. And we're actually going, let's see. Okay, I'm going to tighten it down just a little bit. And now we're going to change camera angles so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so first of all, make sure your zip tie is in that big flat groove. And another note about this is I like to put it on to the left because that way it's easier to get it back off if I ever do this again. And let's see. And also, once you're done putting the zip tie into place, make sure to cut the end flush because you don't want someone cutting themselves. Okay. There we go. Now we're ready to put on the outer tie rod. So remember, to get it off, we turned it 14 revolutions. So this time, to get it back on, we're going to turn it another 14. 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and a 14. And when it's done, you want this side pointing down. Now we're going to go ahead and put the nut onto the end, finger tight. Now we're ready to put in my shock and spring. As you can see, these are aftermarket, so yours, if you're keeping your factory ones, will look a little bit different. But we still have to put the 3 nuts on top. So I've already done the one in the back to hold it into place because you wouldn't be able to see me do that anyway. So now I'm going to put in the front 2. And don't torque these into place until everything is assembled and the truck is back on the ground. So first I'm going to do is put the washer on the flat side. And that's going to come right back up. So let me get the nut as well. Okay. That. So now it's time to put the upper control arm in. This is a bit of a 2-person job, so I went ahead and had my cameraman help me. So you see it's in position here. Don't forget the washer. You'll notice it's a curved washer. And so the curve should be pointing towards the front, at least on this end, and then it'll point towards the outside on this end. So again, don't forget your washers. So we're going to go ahead and run the bolt all the way through and then fasten it on the other side. Time to put the washer and nut on. So there's the washer, and then the nut and the plate should go against the washer. There we go. Tight space. Now we're ready to install the lower control arm. So I chose to use Moog hardware for this job as the factory FJ hardware tends to seize and get a little bit rusty. The Moog hardware is great because it's totally greasable. So just be sure to put it together by Moog's instructions. And this guy, you'll notice, has a sleeve. Okay. So I found it easiest if we come from below and kind of slide it up. Oh, there we go. Okay. Another awkward job. Yep. Perfect. So you may have a little bit of a struggle. So with the washers, just make sure the lettering is pointing out. That. And I'm just going to put this on loosely to hold it in place, and I'll get the other side in. And there we go. And again, washer lettering side out. And I'll go ahead and finger tight this as well. Woo, okay, moving on. Now we're ready to put the knuckle back together. So this is my knuckle, it's aftermarket. It comes with the Rough Country kit. Yours will be a little bit different if you're going with factory, but it's still the same assembly to put it back together. So I've got my old backing plate and I've got my wheel hub and bearing. So what we're gonna do first is put a thin layer of grease right in here. Nothing too messy, just a thin layer is fine. And again, over here with the O-ring, you're gonna wanna take that off, grease it up a little bit, and then put it back on. Just a note about this, since this is all magnet right here, you never want to store it on the other side because you could damage it. And another note, once this is apart, make sure you put the bolts in, because once this is back together, you're not gonna, there's not gonna be any space to put the bolts back in. Yeah, that was a long way of saying that. Okay. So first what we're going to do is put the backing plate on, and you'll notice there's a couple of notches right here and right here. And these will fit right, let me move this so I have room. So there's basically only one way to get this on, and it's always going to fit facing this direction. So we'll go ahead and you'll hear it almost fit into place. So not. There we go. Okay, so that's into place right there. The notches are in their little holes and we're good. So now we're going to go ahead and pick this up and fit in the bolts. And so obviously we're going to be a little careful. There we go. And try not to get your finger. Okay, and now we're going to go ahead and finger tight. So another little note about this bearing, while you're finger tightening it, it's a good idea to kind of lift them up to give yourself a little bit more room. And harder with little hands, but such as it is. There we go. Fingers get tired. Definitely a workout for your fingers. Those look pretty good. Nice. So another note about this, make sure the hub is seated correctly into the knuckle while you're tightening, and you want to tighten in a uniform manner, like this nut over here, and then over here, and then this one, and then this one. Because if you just go kind of around, it may shift inside and then you'll be up that familiar creek. So these are pretty much finger tight. I'm going to hit it up with the wrench just to get them a little bit tighter, and then as soon as this is all done, I'll torque them up to factory spec. So I've got a brand new axle here, but if you're going to be reusing yours, it's a good idea to check that this metal piece isn't bent at all and that this metal piece isn't bent. Okay, so before we begin, we want to go ahead and grease the splines right here and then the contact at the other side. We don't want to go ahead and just kind of shove the whole axle in because you may damage it. So I'm going to show you what to do when it's just a one-person job. So I'm going to gently kind of place in the end until it stops. And then with this end, I'm going to go ahead and grab a bungee cord and put the loop in like this and connect it at the top as so. So now you see it's just kind of precariously hanging, and we're ready to move on. So a couple of what not to do's before we begin. You'll notice in some videos that people will have maybe one hand down here, another hand on the spline, and they'll try to use it as a plunger and then just try to, like, as a battering ram and just, you know, try to get it in. That's not a good idea. This is also not a good idea because you'll wreck the CV. I'll show you what to do. So first of all, make sure your axle is nice and straight. Now we're going to go ahead and put our pry bar into the notch on the CV. After that, we're going to bang on it with our recoilless hammer to basically seat the C clip. So it's kind of a reverse of what we were doing with the slide hammer to get the axle off, but this time we're reseating it. And please note, this may take more than a couple bangs to get it back on. These can be a little bit of a bear to get reseated. So as you can see, it's seated just about all the way. So we're going to give it a couple more whacks. And we should be good. Yeah, that looks great. Now it's time to connect the lower control arm to the strut. And for this bolt, I'm using factory hardware. And to fit this through, if it doesn't go on as nice as this, the strut will move a little bit from side to side. And you want to put the bolt from the back to the front of the car. There we go. And you may have to push the lower control arm a little bit back as well. There. And you can throw on your washer. And we're going to go ahead and finger tighten on the nut. Awesome. So now we have to make sure that the seal is seated properly back into the knuckle. You got to be careful with this guy because he's like a tin can. He'll just crush at the lightest, touch, basically. So what we're going to do is take a piece of wood, lay it flat on top, and then go ahead and bang on it a little bit with your hammer until perfectly seated. So we're going to try to get a different angle on this to show you exactly what we mean. And as always, remember not to bang your fingers. So you'll want to bang it a little bit off center. So as you can see, it's nicely seated onto the knuckle. It's still round for the most part, no, quirky parts. So now that that's done, we're gonna go ahead and grease the rubber part of the seal. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of grease on my finger and kind of go around like that. Maybe a little bit more. Perfect. So now we're getting ready to put our knuckle back on. I decided to put the lower control arm on a jack just to kind of get it up and out of the way, basically. So first we're going to put on this lower knuckle bracket and make sure the steering stop is towards the front of the car. So this goes right down here, and we're going to put the nut on finger tight. If I can do this. There we go. Sometimes it takes the smart hand to start it. Once this is finger tight, I will show you what comes next. Okay. So now we're finally ready to put the knuckle on. So what we're going to do is I'm going to balance this on my leg, and we're going to feed the axle through the hub. And once that's on, you can almost balance it to put the nuts on underneath, or the bolts on from underneath. So, okay. There we go. So that's on. Obviously you want to be careful. Okay, and once that's fed through, you can almost balance it on the bracket underneath. But now we got to feed the bolt through. So this can be a little bit of a dance as well. And be careful with these bolts because they are a little bit fine thread. There we go. Okay, so that one's on. And let's go ahead and put on the other. Perfect. That one's a little bit easier now that we've got the left one lined up. So I'm going to go ahead and finger tight. We're getting so close, guys. This is exciting. Okay, so those are finger tight. Now we're going to come up here and attach the knuckle to the upper control arm. And so to do this, we're going to take off this bolt. There we go, or nut. And it should. Sweet. So it may be a little bit of a hard press down, but you can see the end is in sight. And there we go. There we are. Okay, so I was even able to finger tighten that one down too. Let's move on. So now we're going to put this ABS wire bracket back into place. Okay. Now we're going to hook up the sensor temporarily so that we can put this bracket back on. And I'm warning you now, this bracket is not fun. So the easiest way to do it is put the bolt through the hole first. If you can see it. Oops. My sensor fell out. Okay. And then I'm using this little ratchet here to get a better hold on it. And that way it seems to be a little bit easier. Oops. To get it in. There we go. So you may have to fight with this one a bit. Okay, we are good to go. Now that the sensor bracket is into place, it's time to bolt down the sensor. So you may have to move this a little bit to get the bolt started, and then after that we can bolt it down. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Now we're going to reconnect the tie rod to the knuckle. And this should fit in. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So I'm going to finger tighten this for now. Voila. Now we're going to reconnect the sway bar end link to the sway bar and the knuckle. You may have to jack everything up to get both sides to fit. There we go. And I'm just going to finger tighten these nuts. Okay. Okay, let's throw the rotor back on. Perfect. Now we're going to throw the calipers on. Remember my trick from my last brake video is we throw a nut on the rotor and that keeps it into place, so at least you're not fighting two things at once. Okay. And this is a little bit spring-loaded, so we've got to be careful. Oh, perfect. Throw my nuts on. And I'm just going to finger tight for now. Okay, we're moving on. Okay, now let's go ahead and torque these caliper bolts to 91 foot-pounds, which is basically factory spec. There we go. So that's the bottom one, and now we're moving to the top one. Oops. There we go. Perfect. Okay. Okay, I'm going to try to torque this back to factory spec. It's 174 foot-pounds of torquing, so I may not be able to do it. It may not be big enough, but I'm going to try. For this one, you're going to want someone to step on the brake, or you're going to have to put the wheel and tire back on to get it, back on the ground for it to basically be steady. Okay, let's give this a try. I got it. I put my entire body on it, but I got it. Okay guys, now that we have the nut torqued down to spec, we're going to go ahead and put on the castle lock. So the castle lock and then the cotter pin itself. So with this castle lock, you'll see how it has a lot of these indents here. So you're going to try to match that with the hole that the cotter pin is going through. So basically, okay, see that actually lined up really, really well. But in the event that it doesn't, you can go ahead and tighten up the nut a little bit. Don't ever loosen it, because then you're, not factory spec anymore. So, okay, now we can go ahead and put in the cotter pin. Boop, like that. And, okay, so there's a couple schools of thought with how to bend the cotter pin back. Normally, I do like to bend them up and over, But in this case, the fitment is going to be so tight that I'm going to actually separate them and try to wrap them around rather than up and in front. So first you grab it by the end and kind of bend it back like that, and that's actually going pretty well. Okay, that looks pretty good. Time to move on. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a closer view. Leaving the cotter pin ends up a little bit is fine, but I'm a little bit more of a perfectionist, so I like them to be a little bit closer. So what we're going to do here is, you can see I turned everything, and I'm just going to kind of hammer down a little bit. As such. And to me, that looks good. Now let's go ahead and reattach this brake line bracket to the knuckle. Great. Now we're going to torque the nut on the end of the sway bar end link to the knuckle. Before you torque it down, go ahead and use a wrench and an Allen key to make sure that it's fully tight. If you don't use them both together, the stud is just going to spin. Now go ahead and repeat this step on the other end of the sway bar end link. Now let's torque the upper ball joint to knuckle. There we go. So as you can see, my castle nut and cotter pin hole don't match up. So we can't have this. So we're going to go ahead and tighten up the castle nut just a little bit more until they align. And I almost got it. Actually, you know what? That looks good. We're going to go ahead and try it. Now we're ready to put in the cotter pin. So I'm going to go in through the back here, and as a general rule, you want the smaller end or the shorter end on top. Just like that. Okay, so now we're going to grab on to the longer end and bend over, and then we're going to grab the short end and bend it over to the top, which sounds funny, but we're also going to trim these because you don't want the tip of each to go past to the knuckle right here. You want it to kind of end right before the knuckle, and then this one you don't want any leads, you know, trailing over to the bottom. And always wear your safety glasses because you don't want this cotter pin in your eye. So first I'm going to grab the longer end here, and I'm going to grab the shorter end. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and trim. I've got my glasses on. Okay, so I'm going to cut right about here. There we go. Sorry guys, had to change out batteries there. Okay, well, let's get back to trimming. Go. And I'm going to trim this one just a little bit more. Okay. Okay, now we're going to torque down the outer tie rod to the knuckle. So this is kind of the same drill as before. It's another castle nut. So we're going to go ahead and torque that, like I just said. And we're not going to show the cotter pin this time just because you've seen how it's done on the upper one. But just make sure you do line them up. There we go. And yeah, I'll have to work on getting this lined up. Now we're ready to tighten down the lower ball joint to knuckle. And this one, as you can see, is in a wonderful position. Go for attempt number 2. There we go. And now you're going to repeat the process with the cotter pin and like I showed you before, and we'll move on. Okay, now we'll torque the ball joint bracket to knuckle bolts. Perfect. Awesome. Oh, these ones are tough. Okay, now we're going to put the dust cover back on. So sometimes this can be a bit of a bear to get on or to get started, but if you find it doesn't go on at all straight, you can just lightly bend the outside just a teensy bit to get it back on. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of fit it on lightly. So this looks good. And when you do put it on, you want to make sure it's as straight as possible. Okay, so once it's kind of sitting in there lightly, you're going to go ahead and take a crowbar and a hammer and just lightly start tapping it lightly on. And you want to keep it symmetrical because, again, you don't want this going on like, you know, sideways or crooked. Crooked, that's the word I was looking for. And you'll know it's all the way in when the taps at the end of the crowbar or pry bar get a little muffled. Okay, this looks great. You can see it's all perfectly seated and it's time to move on. Okay, since my wheel hub is brand new, all my studs are super clean. Now, if you're going to be reusing yours, go ahead and get these studs super duper clean before you do anything else. Okay, moving on. Now I'm going to put just a teensy tiny bit of red Loctite on each of these. Just a little bit to ensure that the bolts stay tight. Yep, there's a little bit much. Okay, and this stuff comes out super quick, so you got to be careful about that. Okay, now we're going to put on the wheel spacer and the nuts, and the taper side will basically be in closest to the hub. Okay, I think I've got each of these guys now. Perfect. We're ready to move on. Well, as you can see, I've replaced my rim and tire. It's back on. So now what we're going to do is lightly thread on all these nuts and lightly hit them up with the power tool. And then once the truck is back on the ground, we'll set it to factory spec. So right now I'm just going to lightly thread these on. And a 6. Okay, let's get this sucker on the ground and torque her up. Okay, now we're ready to torque down our upper control arm. So before you do this, make sure the FJ is down on the floor, all 4 tires, and kind of scooch her back and forth a little bit just to make sure that the suspension has settled. And D of R&D is making me laugh, sorry. Anyway, you'll notice I have my torque wrench in place up here. And I also have a box wrench on the other side of the lower or upper control arm here. So it's going to look like I'm giving her a bit of a hug, which I kind of am because I missed her so much. Okay, let's do this. Oh, there we go. Moving on. Now we're going to torque the lower shock bolt. So you'll see I have my torque wrench in place here. And then I have a wrench with the box side on the other side. You don't need to hold that. It's kind of wedged there in place. Oh my God. I'm going to have to hang from it. There we go. Apparently that's all it needed. Huh. Now we're ready to torque the bolts from the lower control arm to the frame. Unfortunately, I just don't have the arm strength or space to get this done myself, so I'm going to employ a little helper of mine. But I can talk you through it. So we're talking about these guys right here and then over here. So on this half, the bolt and nut are both 24 millimeter. On the other side, the bolt is actually 22 millimeters and the nut is 21 millimeters. You're going to need a breaker bar as well as a torque wrench, just to kind of keep steady while you're torquing. And since mine were dirty under here, I'm kind of, for the Moog hardware anyway, I just kind of went by the shadow of the dirt where they should have been placed. So, yep, that's about it. Okay guys, the job is almost complete, but there's still a couple things you need to do. First of all, make sure everything is clipped in, is plugged in, is torqued down. Just even a second set of eyes is probably a good idea with a big job like this. You'll also want to retop the fluid in the diff just to make up for anything we might have lost. Okay, and then after that's done, at least as far as we're concerned, we're going to go ahead, get a new set of tires, and then we're going to kick her over to the alignment shop. This is extremely important. Anytime you mess with the suspension, you're going to want to get a realignment. But all said and done, this was a fantastic job. I'm glad to have done it for R&Dgarage. Happy to do it for you guys. Happy New Year. So exciting, 2020. We have a bunch in store for you guys. And as always, thank you so much for subscribing to R&Dgarage and liking my videos. Take care.